A few of you guys have been asking me about what sort of things you should be reading to prepare yourself for Section 2. Aside from, articles, journal papers, whatever floats your boat in that sense. Now, let me say this before I do recommend the things that I would read if I were you. I don't think that reading anything in particular is going to guarantee you a good mark in Section 2. There isn't a secret weapon, there isn't some secret out there that's going to get you that mark. Getting you that mark that you want in Section 2 is going to be up to your essay writing, your preparation, everything that goes into you actually writing your essays and developing a good formula to do so. However, when I was in my second year of my communications degree, I was majoring in creative writing, and I took a class about nonfiction writing, and my teacher said to me, if you want to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader. Ironically, he was a teacher, but it kind of stuck with me because I think to be a good writer, we at least have to know how to write well. And often the people that can show us that are professionals, people who are professional writers or authors. So here are some of the books that helped me throughout my preparation that aren't, necessarily going to save your life or get you that mark, but that kind of opened my eyes to different things about the world and contributed to my knowledge and just overall things that I would read if I were preparing for Section 2 for the first time. Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Kate Robson and I scored 80 in Section 2 of the GAMSAT in March last year. And since then, I've just been making videos for you guys on this channel to help you to do so. So if you enjoy this content, please feel free to give this video a like because it really helps me out and helps me spread the word. And if you're new here as well, feel free to subscribe because I really will appreciate it. Now, before we get started, I do just want to pop in a little plug here. If you don't know already, I have created an online course, an extensive guide through Section 2 to help you guys be able to score an 80 or above in Section 2 as well. When I was preparing for my GAMSAT in March last year, I realized that the Section 2 resources out there aren't perfect yet. So I thought I would contribute to that space and give you guys the resources that I wish I had when I was preparing. So if you haven't already enrolled, click in the link in the video description and you can enroll now, and it essentially will help you just step by step figure out how to write 80 plus scoring essays. As well, if you do want some more help with reading, I am running an email newsletter in which every week I include a research recommendation, something that I think would make for a good example in Section 2. Yeah, it'll save you your research doing it yourself because I kind of summarize the topics. So yeah, that I'll link in the video description as well. So today I've kind of tried to collate a little mix of authors who are from different races, different cultures, different countries, different times, different genres. I will be recommending 5 today, and these are kind of like my top 5. The 5 that I think, well, at least I enjoyed the most and maybe had a great impact on me. But obviously there are so many more out there, and my number one tip actually is just to read for fun. Read what you want to, I'd rather you guys read something that you want to read and enjoy it and kind of like fall in love with writing and reading in that sense. But if you are out of ideas and you want to know what I've been reading, then these are the ones. So the first recommendation I have is Beloved by Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison was an African-American writer who sadly passed away in 2019, but she wrote extensively throughout the 1970s and 1980s, primarily about African-American issues and racial injustice. She was actually the only African-American writer and one of the only women to ever receive the Nobel Prize for Literature, which is no surprise because Beloved is one of the most amazing books I've ever read. It's set just after the American Civil War in the 1850s in Ohio and tells the story of one woman, Setha, and her 2 daughters. Setha was an ex-slave. She was freed. The story is inspired, in fact, by a true story on a real woman called Margaret Garner, who was an enslaved person in Kentucky and then escaped to the free state of Ohio in 1856. The story is tragic, sometimes confusing, but ultimately lovely and enlightening and inspiring into the torturous tragic conditions that slaves worked in, lived in, and were treated in by white Americans prior to the Civil War. It confused me a little bit in the beginning because her style of writing is very unique. She kind of jumps between the present and the past and uses flashback and memory as a major theme in her book to highlight the significance of the trauma of the past in being embodied in the present. The kinds of themes that it touches on are slavery, racism, African America, generational trauma, memory, and the past. And all of these things, I think, have contributed to my understanding of slavery in America and why racism in America is such a long-standing, deep-rooted issue. Toni Morrison is also quite the woman. She's incredibly well-spoken. She has an amazing talent for writing, and she was an activist for African American issues and was brave enough to tell the stories of African American lives who were lost and forgotten in America. To racism, discrimination, slavery, awful social injustice issues that still perpetuate throughout society in America today. This one can be a bit dark, it can be a lot to swallow, but it's also, I think, important to expose ourselves to it, to understand the history of what happened in America and the fact that these people were subjected to such atrocities and many of their lives were forgotten or lost. So the next recommendation is essays by George Orwell. George Orwell, I mean, you probably know his name because he was the writer of 1984, the infamous dystopian novel, and Animal Farm, its shorter cousin. I read both of these when I was younger, but this year I read some of George Orwell's essays. Some people don't know, but George Orwell was one of England's most famous writers and journalists, and he actually wrote a lot of essays covering his travels while fighting in the Spanish Civil War and his experience throughout World War II. Orwell lived quite a short life. He died at the age of 47 in 1950, but on his deathbed he'd left some kind of remarkable words. At least it was kind of a warning that he left. He said, "Don't let it happen, it depends on you." By it, he was referring to the rise of totalitarianism and the downfall of socialism. Orwell was a very big, outspoken proponent of socialism and a vehemently overt opponent of totalitarianism. The idea that one party or one dictator was going to take over the state and rule it and form a sort of Big Brother-esque position in the world, like in 1984. He was worried that that was going to happen instead of socialism, which he believed in much more strongly. And he writes about this extensively in his essays. He also writes about not only politics, but writing about his past, about the war, about the English language, so many different things that I think kind of contributed to my understanding of not only that time period, but the politics of that time period and Orwell as a writer. He even says it himself in Why I Write, written in 1949, which was 1 year before his death. He said, "Every line of serious work I have written since 1938 has been written, directly or indirectly, against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism, as I understand it." So the reason I'm suggesting this one is, I mean, it's kind of the only classic writer I'm really suggesting, because I think he really helped my understanding of politics, totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and opened my eyes to the potential ideas of the state, the formation of a one-party state, and the rule of the state and the threat of Big Brother. Whereas I think living in a capitalist society, we think about these things less, especially when it's quite stable like Australia is. It can also be a doorway if you want to learn more about socialism, communism, things that are happening in Eastern Europe and Asia. And yeah, it might help you with that. Plus, the essays are all quite short. They're pretty easy to get through. I think you can download copies online and just have a read through of them. He writes pretty straightforwardly. He doesn't really mess around with metaphors or any figurative language. So if you want to ingest some overt political writing, then maybe you should check him out. The third recommendation I've got is R. Chang's King of Trees. Now, This one actually I read for a university assignment, for which I wrote my final essay on, for a subject that I took last semester. And it's all about Maoism, the educated youth during the Cultural Revolution, China, communism, Marxism, but also about national identity, culture, and nature. The King of Trees is a series of novellas. One of the novellas in that is called The King of Trees, so they're also quite short, but they're a real eye-opener into what life was like during the Cultural Revolution in China. The Cultural Revolution, if you don't know, took place over the space of about 10 years in the 1960s and 1970s under the power of Mao. Chairman Mao. Ah Cheng published this series of novellas in the 1980s and it was later translated, but it was essentially about his experience during the 1950s when he was sent to the countryside to learn from the peasants, as Mao intended for the Chinese population to do. It's very interesting because a lot of the pictures that have been painted about the Cultural Revolution are very negative, because obviously it was a massively tragic event and Mao caused grave suffering to the Chinese society and millions of Chinese lives were lost during his power. But Ah Cheng's recount of the story show that it wasn't necessarily all bad for the Chinese people living during that time, and they really believed, or some of them really believed, in the message that Mao was trying to deliver and encourage them to also believe in. So it shows the difficulty of perhaps living in a communist society where lots of good things are promised for you in your country, but that you also see a lot of pain and suffering and heartbreak and damage and destruction happening. If you don't know that much about China, it's a great place to start. It will open your eyes to so many different facets of Chinese history that I just didn't even know about in the slightest. I obviously don't know everything yet, but I certainly know a lot more than I used to. And I think he's a great writer as well. Now, this one I was actually kind of tossing up amongst a few others because I wanted to recommend an Indigenous writer. So the other ones that I can recommend are Black Work by Alison Whittaker, Dark Emu, Fire Country and The White Girl by Tony Birch, and Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia. However, I've gone with this one just because I really enjoyed it as a novel and as a story, and it kind of relit my love for fiction. It's not 100% about Indigenous Australians, but there is an Indigenous Australian character within it, and he is central to the story. It's also set in a small town in Western Australia, which kind of highlights the racism that exists in parts of Australia still. The themes that Craig Silvey explores in it are Indigenous Australia, racism, friendship, family. It's also a murder mystery, which was kind of exciting. And I just really enjoyed reading a piece of Australian literature because I haven't read that much. I think it also kind of inspired me to want to read more Australian literature and more Indigenous Australian literature. So if you are looking for something to literally read within a few days, I was stuck with it. I got through it so quickly because I was loving it so much. Then perhaps you want to check this one out. Now, the final one is a bit of a random one, but I did kind of recommend this in another video. I read it 2 years ago when it came out. It came out in 2019 and I read it in 2020. During the midst of lockdown as well, and it was kind of fitting. This one is called Phosphorescence by Julia Baird. And Julia Baird is an Australian journalist. She lives in Sydney and she wrote a book essentially about finding wonder and awe when things get tough in times of darkness. And I think it was perfect to read in lockdown. So it might still be good to read now, seeing as we're still, in the third episode of the third season of the pandemic. And it's mostly just about finding beauty in nature, finding wonder in nature. She talks about biophilia, which is a sense of loving for nature. She talks about phosphorescence, which is a luminescent phenomenon in nature that she's been inspired by, in awe of. And she talks about how a connection with nature has really helped her with mental health and how it inspires humans to connect with nature and it ignites a sense of awe and wonder within us. She also frequently mentions stories of Indigenous Australia and the meaning behind our land and these biological phenomena. And I really liked the way she kind of married a narrative style with a more non-fiction style. So if you like science and non-fiction stuff, but you also like to read stuff that's kind of written more beautifully in a more narrative style, then this one is perfect. I remember it just just left me with a sense of wonder and awe and hope that I could find something beautiful in a pretty crappy time during lockdown. And I've recommended it to friends and they've also loved it, so feel free to check out that one as well. I've linked all the books in the video description below, so if you want to pick up a copy of them, then feel free to click on them, grab a copy for yourself and have a read through. Although my number one tip is remember just to read whatever you want. You don't have to by all means read any of these or all of these, but perhaps you want to pick one or two that you really like the sound of and dedicate the next couple weeks to getting through them. If you read for fun, then you'll more likely like reading in general and then hopefully writing in general, but also try and focus on picking up little spots of vocabulary or language and style, rhetorical devices or stylistic devices that they use. And for the non-fiction ones, then try and pick up some knowledge that you're learning and put that into your notes. Even though a lot of these are fiction books, you can use them to provide context to real life because a lot of them are kind of based on real life as well, like racism, nature, science, nationalism, history, that will hopefully contribute to your overall knowledge and background knowledge for section 2. So I hope that helped. If you do go and read some of these books, I hope you like them. Let me know in the comments below if you have read any of these and you like them, or if you have any other reading recommendations, then chuck them below in the comments. Otherwise, I explore some reading recommendations more in the course called Essays Made Easy, which I'll also link in the video description. So yeah, I hope that helped, and happy reading, happy writing, and I'll see you for the next video very soon.
So girls, move it around. If you see your main dog, get the brother a pound and just